we are in the middle of a series. We're in the middle of a series called Trusting God with Your Finances. And we've been through a number of weeks, so I wanted to give you a really quick rundown of some of the big picture ideas that we've covered so far. So first we started with this idea that money problems are heart problems. And we've got to start there. You've got to believe that money problems begin in the heart. It doesn't begin with your wallet. It doesn't begin with your bank account. It begins in your heart. And God is in the heart restoration business. That's why I believe that God is a great person to look to for wisdom when it comes to money, because money problems are heart problems. Then we also talked about this idea that how you see God will depend whether you really want to trust him. Because the truth is, if you don't really see God as good, and if you don't really see God as giving, you're not going to want to trust him. And so that's critical that you see God for all of his goodness and his abundance of givingness. I made up a new term for that one. Patent pending right there, okay? So his givingness, you've got to believe in that if you really want to trust him with your finances. And then a couple weeks ago, we also talked about, and we started to introduce these big picture biblical principles when it comes to money. The first one we talked about was stewardship. Ooh, there we go. Now I'm feeling the vibe there, okay? So the first one we talked about was stewardship, where fundamentally it's this: God owns all of it. We just manage it. That's what this word steward means. You hear it around churches a lot. It's really a manager. God owns everything. Everything you own is God's. The house you're living in, the car you're driving, the job you have, the paycheck you receive, the paycheck you earn. No, it's all God's. We just manage it. And God calls us to be great, smart, wise managers of his stuff. And then last week we talked about generosity. And a lot of times we make our generosity dependent on stuff. Sometimes traditional Hmong culture says that your generosity is dependent on reciprocity. In other words, I'll go to your party, but I know you'll come to my party. I'll give you a loan because you're in need, but I know when I'm in need, I'll expect a loan. So our generosity, traditional culture says that our generosity is dependent on reciprocity. Okay? Traditional American culture says generosity is dependent on financial stability. Work on your own stuff first. Get financially stable, get that education, get that job, get that paycheck. Then you can be generous. But take care of yourself first. That's that good old American individualism. But what I talked about last week was that for God's view of generosity is that to God, generosity is dependent on God's generosity to us. And remember, he is good and giving. So he is abundantly generous. And so our generosity should not be dependent on our families or our own financial stability, but it should be dependent on God's generosity to us. And God is really generous with us. So if you missed any of those guys, you can find them online, riverlifemn.com/sermons. We're still working on getting caught up on all of these, but we'll get all of these caught up very soon. So it's a great way to catch up on some of the past sermons. Now this week, I want to talk about an interesting topic. And this is actually the topic, this is the very first thing I ever really learned about Southeast Asia. Okay? Other than basic geography, like it's kind of below China and above Australia, that kind of stuff. So this was probably middle school or so, before I ever heard about Hmong people. Didn't know anything about Hmong people, didn't know anything about anybody, but I learned in 7th grade world history class that there's this thing in Southeast Asia, there's a practice called slash and burn farming. How many of you ever heard of slash and burn farming? And okay, yeah, so a bunch of you, okay? Excuse me. So what slash and burn farming is basically it's an agricultural technique where a field, usually with trees and bushes and stuff, all of it is chopped down and then torched, and then all the ash fertilizes the soil, and you get good farmland. So it's called slash because you slash it with the gigantic machetes, and then burn, and then you get farmland. Okay? Now, this technique has a couple really good advantages. One is you get tons of farmland. Wherever there is land, even if there are trees on it, you slash and burn, and you've got farmland. The other thing that it does is it produces all this ash, actually produces really rich soil. It produces great, rich, kind of instantaneous soil. It takes about a year and a half or so for this whole process, but you get very rich soil. However, there are some problems with it. This really rich soil only lasts a few years because it's not, the nutrients aren't deep in the soil. It's just the ash that has gone down. So this good soil only lasts a couple years, and then the soil becomes depleted. In farmer terms, it talks about the soil gets exhausted. It can't bear plants anymore. You can't grow your beans and things like your rice and things like that, okay? So then all of a sudden you have to move to another plot of land because this one isn't producing good crops. So you have to move to another plot of land, and then guess what you have to do with this one? You have to slash and burn. And then the problem is this plot of land basically becomes unfarmable for 10 to 20 years. And it just has to lay fallow. So then you go to this one, and you farm for 1 to 2 years. Maybe you're lucky and you get 3 years. Then you have to go to a new farm. Now, if you do the math on this, 10 to 20 years to recover, and only 2 to 3 years of farming, you can see where this is going. The problem with slash and burn farming is that it's great in the short term. You get really good crops, but it's terrible in the long term because you just end up chopping down forest after forest after forest. Okay? And if that wasn't bad enough, you also risk a very high erosion factor because the trees and roots are actually what help prevent erosion. So if you get rid of all the trees and roots, a good monsoon comes, and you've got runoff. Your whole field is going down the hill. So that's part of what happens when cultures and groups of people practice this slash and burn farming. It is great in the short term, but terrible in the long term. And that's why this type of practice it really only works for small populations. It's not sustainable as a population grows. You'll very quickly essentially deforest your land. And eventually, you'll end up with completely unusable land. And so this is practiced not just in Southeast Asia, but as I've read more about it, it's practiced in South America, even in Australia, and then Southeast Asia and parts of India as well. But it's really only practiced by people who live in subsistence farming. In other words, that's you farm for what you're going to eat that day. That sort of stuff. So this idea of making a short-term decision that's really good in the short term, but terrible in the long term, that's kind of wired into a lot of the cultures that practice slash and burn farming. Now, I didn't really know, and then now fast forward 20 years. There's little 7th grade Greg. Now fast forward 20 years, and here I am. I'd been with the monk for a little while, and never heard anyone talk about slash and burn farming. So I'm like, okay, were they just pulling my leg on this one? Is this one of these things that like white people tell about Hmong people, but it's not really true? Is it one of those things? Then all of a sudden I'm at this, I visited youth. I was in youth ministry at the time, and I visited this guy's house. We're hanging out, and I know his dad as well. And so his dad comes up. He had just come back from Laos. And he came back, and he was so excited to tell me about their trip. And so he broke out a little photo album. This is back when people actually printed out photos. Okay, that's how old this story is. So he broke out this photo album and started showing me all the pictures of his trip back to Laos and Thailand. And then he got so excited to tell me about what him and a bunch of the guys in the village did. He said, we got more fish than we've ever gotten before. Here's how we did it. We got some bamboo, and some big bamboo, and cut it in half. And if your parents have ever told stories about the bamboo, that if you cut it in half, it makes a great water trough. Okay? So that's what they did. Big bamboo, cut in half, and then there was this small lake. Whether it was a small lake or an oversized pond, I don't really know. But imagine a small lake. And so a whole bunch of them, with a whole bunch of bamboo, proceeded to drain the lake with this bamboo. And literally, like a whole 20 or 30 of these guys proceeded to take all the water out of this lake and drain it down the hill. And they collected all the fish in the entire lake. Imagine that for a fishing trip. So how'd you do? It was great. I caught every fish in the lake. You're like, all right. Then the DNR arrested me, and then, no, okay. And he was so excited. It's like, we fed the entire village with this. But as he was telling me this story, I got kind of sad because they just destroyed a lake. They got more fish in one day than they've ever seen before. But now they get no more fish. And I was like, wow. Hmong do practice slash and burn farming or slash and burn fishing. And I sat there and I was really sad that he couldn't see the long term. All he could see was the short-term benefit without seeing the long-term consequences. And I wasn't about to try and point this out to him. He was way too excited for this. And so then I started to look for this pattern of short-term decision-making. And you know what? I began to see it a lot. And in fact, I'm willing to bet you can probably think of your family, maybe growing up. And you watched your parents or your uncles or aunties, grandmas, grandpas, and you could probably pull out from memory a couple decisions that were made that were great in the short term, but 5-10 years later, it turned out to be a really bad decision for the family. And I think what happens is this idea of short-term decision-making is kind of wired into Hmong culture. Because most of you, the reality is most of you are only one generation away from subsistence farmers. If your parents were back in Laos, chances are the majority of them, yeah, some might have worked for the government or the education system, but most probably farmed. They farmed and they ate, they farmed and they ate, and they built stuff and drained lakes. I don't know, okay? But chances are so most of you are just one generation away from subsistence poverty farming. And one of the things that research has shown about poverty, ancient poverty, or poverty in undeveloped nations, or poverty in America, is that poverty in all of its forms drives, almost forces people into short-term decision-making. And so it's fascinating to see some research about poverty in America, where often Americans will, especially middle-class white Americans, will blame the poor for making bad decisions. But what some recent research in the last couple of years has shown is that poverty itself actually forces and pushes people into short-term decisions without looking at the long-term consequences. So I think this slash and burn is kind of wired into culture for a lot of you. The idea of short-term decision-making while ignoring long-term consequences. Now, so I think this is more than just farming. I think it's more than just fishing. I actually think that we as a whole, among and Mika cultures here, that we all practice slash and burn economics. Slash and burn economics. Let me tell you a little bit about slash and burn economics. Credit cards. Buying big things on credit cards is a perfect example of slash and burn economics. I want it now. I want that new phone now. I'm going to pay for it later. I might even pay twice the amount by the time all the finance charges are due. Okay? But I want it now. Credit cards are the classic slash and burn economics. Okay, what else? I think that even you're standing down at MOA and you're sitting there and you buy that thing you really want. Okay? It's a cute new dress. It's a new pair of kicks. It's that whatever it is that you want. And you buy it. You know you shouldn't. You know, maybe you just got the paycheck so you buy it right away before the money's gone. Okay? That's slash and burn. Because you want it right now. I don't care about having to pay for it, or I don't care that we're going to be tight on money this month because bills don't come for another two weeks. I want it now. So buying things that you want, even if you've got the money in the bank. Okay, what else? How about that vacation that you take? Because work has been hard, and the kids are driving you nuts, and the weather sucks during winter, and you want that vacation down to Mexico because you deserve it. So what do? You put it on the card. Or maybe you put half of it. Recent research came out saying that the average American puts about 50% of a vacation cost on a credit card. So I don't know about the vacations you've taken lately, but maybe you've charged those because that vacation is something you want now, and I'll deal with the consequences later. There's more. Even the idea of taking out huge student loans. If you take out huge student loans to go to an expensive private college, when there are some public colleges that could, chances are, give you the same decent education in your field, and all of a sudden you've racked up, we were talking with a couple just this week, and they have over $130,000 in student loans between the two of them, and they have no idea how they're going to pay it off. What do you do when you're making just a few bucks over minimum wage, or you're not working full time because they keep changing your shift around? What do you do? So even that idea of taking out huge student loans can be a case of slash and burn economics. Okay, or how about this one? This is one that I saw a lot when I was in youth ministry, was dropping out of college to work, or not going to college at all because you got a good job after high school. Now, I'm not saying this is true for everyone. I know folks who have worked up and ended up in great positions, didn't go to college, but generally speaking, the pattern that I've seen, and I'm willing to bet you've seen it as well, someone drops out of college to work. They get a full-time job, all of a sudden they're making more money than they've ever made. They're like, why go back to college? Because it's a great decision in the here and now. But you know what? Fast forward 10 years, fast forward 15 years, chances are what was a great decision then is not so great a decision now. And chances are that person who made a tough decision to either go to college or stay in college 15, even 20 years down the road is much happier they made that decision. So even dropping out of school or not going to school can be a case of slash and burn economics, where all we pay attention to is the short-term benefit and ignore the long-term consequences. So, how do you practice slash and burn? What do you do in your life? Can you think of something right now when it comes to money? Can you think of something right now that you're doing or have done in the last year or two where you focused on the short-term benefit and ignored the long-term consequences? Can you think of something? Maybe it's racking up the credit cards. Maybe it's getting into gambling as something started out fun and now it's something huge and it's taken hundreds and thousands of dollars away from you and your family. Okay? Maybe it's spending. Maybe it's the vacations. I don't know what it is for you. But I'm willing to bet there's something in your life. There's something in your life where you have practiced slash and burn. Well, what's God's answer to slash and burn? What's God's way? If that's not a great way of doing this, what's God's way? What's God's alternative? Well, the way to do this, the way to answer that is that we flip the question. That instead of looking at the paying all attention to the short term and ignoring the long term, we flip it. And we start paying a little attention to the long term. Now, there's a passage, there's a teaching that Jesus taught that focused on just that focused on paying less attention to the short term and paying more attention to the long term. It's part of his Sermon on the Mount. And we've actually read a little section of this passage. We're going to read the whole paragraph now, because I believe that this is God's antidote. It's God's antidote to slash and burn. So this is out of Matthew 6. This is Jesus teaching in the Sermon on the Mount. It's out of Matthew 6, starting at verse 19. So just 19 through 24. Here we go. Do not store up for yourself treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourself treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Seems like a pretty straightforward passage, doesn't it? Jesus sets up a contrast. And the truth is, it is actually a pretty straightforward passage. Jesus sets up a contrast. He says, you will store up. Notice he's not saying, don't store up. You will store up. Now, the question is, where will you store? Another way to look at this, store up. We don't store grain in a barn unless you live on a farm. Maybe you do. Rock on, it's Minnesota. If you store grain in a barn, good job. But I'm guessing most of us don't. Okay? And so another way to think of this storing up, think of it as investing. You will invest your money somewhere. Another way to look at it is you will spend. You will spend your money somewhere. And whether you spend it on the now or the later. Do you invest on the stuff of earth or do you invest on the stuff of heaven? Do you look at the immediate or can you look at the future? And that's the contrast Jesus is setting up here. Now, there is one thing that might be a little confusing in this phrase, store up treasures in heaven. Okay, treasures on earth make a little more sense. I picture being like Ron Swanson burying gold in his yard and not telling anyone, okay, for all you Parks and Rec fans out there, okay? So I picture gold and money and cars and homes, okay? Treasures on earth, that kind of makes sense. But what in the world are treasures in heaven? Well, here's a simple answer. I have no idea, okay? Really. And the passage doesn't explain what treasures in heaven are. But I can tell you a few things. Here are a few things that we can tell from this passage. First is, treasures in heaven sound really good. Wouldn't you agree on that? Whatever it is, it sounds pretty good. Okay, let's start there. The next thing we know is that treasures in heaven seem to be God-centric. Somehow, these treasures in heaven somehow revolve around God. And somehow, these treasures on earth revolve around, well, earth. So somehow, these treasures in heaven are God-related. And then lastly, is they last. What these treasures in heaven are is they last. They don't fade away. They don't get stolen. The rats don't come and eat them. But they last. Now, in contrast, Jesus talks about the treasures on earth. Talk about this treasures on earth here, and I don't think we need much explanation on this, and we all know this. We all know cars break down, clothes get holes in them, and if you're guys, they get stains on them because we're messy, okay? Our bodies tend to get wider and droopier and balder. Our things break down. That hot new phone, the phone I got less than 2 years ago, which was the hottest thing on the market at the time, now the camera doesn't even work. We know our stuff of earth breaks down, but the stuff of heaven doesn't. So I think what Jesus is saying here isn't spend or don't spend, invest or don't invest, store up or don't store up. That's not what this is. I think what Jesus is saying is invest wisely. Store up wisely. Spend wisely on stuff that will last versus stuff that won't. And in a sense, I think what Jesus is saying, and this is the solution to slash and burn. This is the solution to slash and burn. If you find yourself trapped in short-term thinking, you know what the solution is? Spend today with tomorrow in mind. Spend today with tomorrow in mind. Because most of us spend today with today in mind. When I'm in front of the fridge and I want to eat, I eat with today in mind. I don't eat with tomorrow in mind. When you go buy that new pair of Jordans because they just came out and they're looking amazing, people are talking about it on Facebook and you got to get them. You're spending with today in mind because you got to get them now. And Jesus says, spend today with tomorrow in mind. Now, this can actually go two ways. First, literally, and that's where we fall into the slash and burn, is we do spend, a credit card is a classic way of we spend today without thinking about tomorrow. We're not going to think about the finance charges. We're not going to think about the late penalties. We're not going to think about all the money the credit card company is making off of me because I want my thing. I want to upgrade my phone. Okay? We want our thing today. So credit cards say, I spend today with today in mind. Jesus says, spend today with tomorrow in mind. But I think this can also be metaphorical. With today being, imagine your whole life was today. Guess what your tomorrow would be? For followers of Christ, your tomorrow is heaven. And so I think metaphorically, Jesus is also saying, spend today, spend in this life, invest in this life with tomorrow, with heaven in mind. Spend with heaven in mind. And invest and store up with heaven in mind. I think that's what he's talking with all this storehouses stuff. So how do we do that? How do we actually spend today with tomorrow in mind? Well, I want to give you 3 ways. I want to give you 3 ways to do this. First, the first is I want to give you a little graph. I want to give you a diagram here. Okay, here we go. Okay, I've got a dot up on the screen. There we go. This dot represents, whoa, there we go. Okay, there, you got the whole sermon. Okay, there we go. Oh my gosh, we're out of control. Okay, there we go. Oh my gosh, it's on like auto scroll. Oh my goodness. Okay, yep, kill it. Put it to sleep. So here we go. Imagine I am a dot. There, okay? Imagine this dot is your life on earth. It's just one little dot. Because in the scale of all time, we are a little speck. So this little dot here represents life on earth. And now, imagine a line going all the way over here and all the way over here and ta-da! There we go. There we go. Just keep going. Imagine a line that just keeps going. That is your eternity. That is your eternity. Now the problem with the way a lot of us use money, we spend money on the dot. We live on the dot. We live for the dot. You know what Jesus is saying? Live for the line. Live for the line. Don't live for the dot, because that dot is a blink when compared to eternity. Don't live for the line. Live for what eternity will be, the things that will last. So that's the first way that you can do this, is that you can live for the line, not the dot. The second way you can do this is, and this one's a little bit more practical. Here it is. Focus on long-term goals, not short-term desires. Notice the difference between that. Goals versus desires. Almost every bad money decision you've made, chances are it's because you are focusing on your short-term desires and ignoring your long-term goals. So I'll meet someone and they'll say, we're saving up to buy a house. That's a long-term goal. But then we're still going out to eat because we don't want to cook. And we're still buying a lot of stuff because it's fun and new stuff and new clothes and new tech. And so notice those short-term desires, those wants, are overruling the goals. We want to be able to move out of my mom's house. Okay, that's a goal. Now what do you do with these desires? You got to put them in check. Because if you live for your short-term desires, you're just draining a lake. you're taking all the fish out of the lake, because long term you'll suffer for it. You'll be, whether you have to sit with your mom longer, or you aren't going to be able to get that house. Or I hear another one is, we want to save up for some missions trip. We want to go on a missions trip. Oh, that's awesome. I love it. Let's do that. But you're still spending the paychecks. So that's one way. So one way is to focus on your long-term goals, the stuff down here, and not your short-term desires. Okay? Now, admittedly, I'm not great at that. I imagine I would be a lot thinner if I were better at that one. I am not great at that. Because eating is all about short-term desires and short-term wants. I want Five Guys. My goal is to lose some weight. Those things don't match too well, especially Five Guys, 5 days, okay? So that's the second one. Third is this. Invest in God's kingdom, not your own. Invest in God's kingdom, not yours. Because, we spend a lot of time building our kingdoms. We spend a lot of time building our kingdoms. Building up our homes, our jobs, our education, our reputation, our skills, our hobbies, gentlemen. We spend a lot of time building up our kingdom. Okay, I'll hit the ladies also. Our closets, ladies. There, guys, feel better? Okay. So we spend a lot of time building up our kingdom. Now, the trick is that stuff, I don't believe that stuff is bad. Nor do I believe the Bible teaches that stuff is bad. Okay? But if you're using that stuff to build your own kingdom, instead of using that stuff to build God's kingdom, then you're missing the boat. Then you're missing the mark. Okay? So think about the way that you invest time, money, energy, skills, the way that you use your stuff, and we'll use that as a collective word, okay? When you think about your stuff, how is it being used? Are you building your kingdom or God's kingdom? So I'll give you a couple examples of what it might look like to use God's kingdom, to build up God's kingdom. Through your investment of money, time, energy, hobbies, skills, are people coming into a relationship with Jesus Christ? Are people finding hope and healing in Jesus Christ? Okay. Is the gospel, is the good news, is saving grace being brought to people of the world who have never heard of saving grace? Are the hungry being fed? Are the vulnerable being protected? Through your spending, your investing of time, talents, money, hobbies, all of that, is there more love and community or more individuality and separateness and division? Those are just a few examples of what it would look like to build God's kingdom. Now, I want to be a church that builds God's kingdom. And if you like that, if that idea is exciting to you, you're in the right place. Now, all of this sounds great. All of this sounds wonderful. Why is it so hard? Why is it so hard to actually do? Well, there's a very simple answer to that. All of this sounds great. Why is it that all of us have such a hard time living out? It's because we all fail one simple test. It's because we all fail one simple test. The Marshmallow Test. We all fail it. Now, you know what the Marshmallow Test is? This guy started about in the late 1960s and early 70s. Some researchers were studying this concept called delayed gratification. And they took some kids in the room, would set up a kid in the room, and then they would tell him this, okay? I will give you one marshmallow right now, or you can wait 15 minutes and I'll give you 2 marshmallows. See where this one's going? And they'd set it up, and then they would leave the room. And they'd have a little camera on the kids. It is one of the most hilarious videos you ever watch. Just go to YouTube and YouTube Marshmallow Test, Marshmallow Quiz. It is hilarious, because the kids are there, they're like, they start singing songs like, happy birthday to me, happy birthday, let it go, let it go. And almost invariably, every single kid, guess what? Takes the one marshmallow. Very few kids actually can hold out the 15 minutes for 2 marshmallows. I don't think we're all that different. Let's be honest. I don't think we hold out for the 2 marshmallows that God promises over here. And time again, we grab for the 1 marshmallow over here. Even though we know we've got 2 over there waiting for us from God. We want the 1 marshmallow. We all fail this test. Psychologists call this the inability to delay gratification. You know what God calls this? Sin. It's our sin nature. We are born wanting 1 marshmallow. We were born not able to resist waiting. We were born wanting the now. We were born ignoring the consequences. We were born selfish. And that's sin. And there are a lot of ways to manage sin, but there's only one way to get rid of sin. And that's through Jesus Christ. The reason Jesus Christ died on a cross, the reason Jesus Christ went through so much is so that he could take your sin away. So that he could take your selfish now desires and replace them with peace, with self-control, with heaven-mindedness. And that's what God offers every one of us. God offers us the will and the ability. In other words, he even allows us to want to delay and wait for the 2 marshmallows. But God is the one who puts that in us. We don't have that. We would all take the 1 marshmallow, let's be honest. But God says, let me empower you to wait. Let me empower you to make long-term decisions. Let me empower you to think about heaven, not earth. Let me empower you to make long-term decisions for the kingdom, not short-term decisions for yourself. So that's what God offers. And if that's something you want, you can turn to God and say, I need that. I need less of my sin running my life, which means, God, I need more of Jesus in me. So we got another worship song here that we're going to sing, and this is a great opportunity as you sing to invite more of Jesus into you. More of Jesus to counteract the slash and burn economics that we all practice, so that we can be kingdom-minded, heaven-driven, long-term, goal-driven people. So we're going to sing another song here, then I'll be up in a little bit later, but it's a great chance for us to ask God for more of Jesus run in our hearts and ruling in our lives.